A lot of MMA fans might not be up to speed on all the rules. Some people even think there are no rules in the Octagon, but they couldn't be more off the mark. MMA has a ton of rules now, and most of them came about because of specific moments in the sport's history. So stay with us in this video to find out the moments that changed MMA rules forever. Diving straight into it, we've got this moment that changed MMA forever by getting elbows banned. You're probably curious how this works since elbows are basically part of a fighter's anatomy. But hold up, it's not like they outlawed the whole elbow, just a certain part of it. Back in the year 2000, there was this epic showdown at the IFC Battery Ground where the towering 6'10" Gan McGee squared off against the much smaller Brad Michael. And believe it or not, it was this one intense battle that led to the ban on certain elbow moves in MMA. So, during that intense match, McGee was raining down those downward elbows on Gabriel's head, while Gabriel was just trying to hang on for dear life. Then, to make things worse, McGee took his back and continued the assault with those old-school Brazilian-style shots to the back of the head. A doctor in the Octagon wasn't having any of it. He saw those elbows as seriously dangerous, like breaking big blocks of ice. So he put his foot down since elbows were dangerous and couldn't be allowed. But hey, at least there was a silver lining. Big John McCarthy managed to clarify that it was only the 6 elbows that were the problem. All the other elbows? Totally fair game. And it's been that way since the dawn of MMA as a sport. So, the numbers actually refer to the face of a clock, and according to this rule, it's illegal to strike with an elbow straight down on your opponent from 12 o'clock to 6 o'clock. Turns out before the 6 elbow rule even came into play, things were about to get even crazier. McCarthy swooped in and saved the day because the original plan was to ban elbows altogether. Can you imagine MMA without elbows? McCarthy had a solid point. Elbows are a big part of Muay Thai after all. Plus, taking away elbows would have just made it harder to keep the action flowing. He knew that limiting techniques could slow things down, like if someone grabs your wrist, you're stuck. But if you can throw an elbow, it's game on. McCarthy's argument almost worked, but the doctor wasn't messing around, especially considering the damage those downward elbows were causing. In the end, they compromised, and only the 6 elbows got banned. This rule even caused John Jones, arguably one of the greatest fighters in Octagon history, to get a loss on his record. He was disqualified from his fight with Matt Hamill for using this illegal strike. Crazy, right? Even though Hamill was seriously beaten up and had to be carried out of the Octagon, the win still went into his column. Moving on, it might not seem like it, but MMA fighters can't rock up to the Octagon in whatever attire they fancy. Nope, there are rules in play, and one of them is a strict ban on Speedos. And get this, it's not just some random decree. Nope, stuff that went down in the Octagon is what led to this rule being laid down. So what went down? Dennis Hallman decided to rock up to his match against Brian Ebersol at UFC 133, sporting these crazy tiny blue trunks that were practically Speedos. And let's just say it was a disaster. Not only did he end up getting smashed in the fight, but those trunks were so impractical that he ended up showing more skin than your favorite ring girl. And if that wasn't enough, Ebersol himself was already making waves with that arrow tattoo right smack on his chest. So the whole situation was just plain bizarre. UFC President Dana White was fuming. He was downright outraged by Hallman's shorts, calling them horrifying and disgusting. He vowed right then and there that no fighter would ever be caught dead wearing something like that in the Octagon again. And can you blame him? Ebersol ended up putting an end to the madness in the first round with a ground-and-pound victory, which Dana White was all about. He even rewarded Ebersol with a whopping $70,000 bonus for getting those horrifying shorts off TV as soon as possible. Dana White was not holding back. He was seriously ticked off at the folks who let Hallman strut out in those shorts. He even went as far as saying he'd never been so embarrassed to be associated with the UFC. He described the situation as bad can get. And if that wasn't enough, he later doubled down, expressing how grossed out he was and how Hallman's Speedo totally crossed the line. So White wasted no time and slapped a ban on any Speedo-like getup being worn inside the Octagon after that whole fiasco. But why on earth did Hallman even show up in a blue Speedo for his UFC showdown? Well, it all boiled down to a lost bet with one of his teammates. Hallman admitted he didn't say what the bet was about, but he lost and had to rock those Speedos. He thought it was all in good fun and didn't expect anyone to get their knickers in a twist about it. Even though he managed to make a submission win in his next UFC bout, his contract was not renewed by the production. Dana might claim it wasn't solely because of the clothing debacle, but let's be real, not many folks get cut after a winning streak. And to add insult to injury, if you Google Dennis Hallman, those Speedos and shorts are usually the first thing that pops up. Still on clothing-based mishaps, Pat M. Miletic and Mikey Burnett somehow got short grabbing banned in the UFC. Nope, they didn't get shorts banned. You just can't grab your opponent's shorts while fighting anymore. In the inaugural welterweight title bout between Pat Miletic and Mikey Burnett back in 1998, their shorts unexpectedly became a crucial factor in the fight. Throughout the match, both men continuously grabbed onto each other's shorts, leading to a stalemate where neither could break free to land significant strikes. After Mikey Burnett beat Eugenio Tadeu in his first UFC fight, he was up against Pat Miletic for the first ever lightweight title, which was basically today's welterweight division. Miletic, a seasoned fighter with 24 bouts under his belt, spent a good chunk of the 21-minute match tugging on Burnett's shorts. Despite that, Burnett managed to score a few takedowns, but Miletic's defense was on point, so he didn't take much damage. After a controversial, unanimous decision, Miletic clinched the victory and the belt. Burnett's next fight was at UFC 18 in 1999, after which he took a long break from MMA. He eventually made a comeback during the 4th season of the Ultimate Fighter reality show. The fight was pretty dull, with both fighters constantly pulling on each other's shorts, which ended up exposing their bodies in ways that were, well, not exactly meant for public viewing. Before stepping into the UFC's famous Octagon, fighters undergo a quick once-over by a commission official and a cutman. The official's job, making sure they've got their protective gear cup, mouthguard and gloves all sorted before they dive into the cage, while the cutman applies some Vaseline on the fighters to help them avoid getting too banged up. You're probably why fighters have to use Vaseline before their fight. Putting Vaseline on the skin helps to keep it soft and supple, reducing the likelihood of tearing when they're hit by minimizing friction. But here's the thing, there's a cap on how much they can use to keep things fair, and it's up to the ref to decide. An infant rubbing Vaseline on the body is against the rules. So, why is that such a fuss in MMA? Well, it's a big deal because of all the grappling and maneuvering that takes place on the ground. At UFC 94, during the BJ Penn versus George St. Pierre fight, St. Pierre faced some issues due to Vaseline. In the fight, Penn and St. Pierre started off by clinching and throwing knees. St. Pierre tried for a takedown, but Penn defended well. They ended up clinching in the middle, with St. Pierre pushing Penn toward the fence. St. Pierre attempted another takedown, but ended up back in the clinch. They kept trading punches until the end of the round. In the second round, they both started swinging, and St. Pierre landed a punch that made Penn's nose bleed. Then St. Pierre clinched and took Penn down. While on top, Penn attempted a triangle choke or an armbar, but it's tough to get a good grip when your opponent is slippery. So after George St. Pierre won the fight, BJ Penn wasn't too happy. He filed a formal complaint to the NSAC, claiming St. Pierre used some sneaky greasing stuff during the fight. The complaint was a whopping 20 pages long, mentioning that other fighters had similar slip-and-slide encounters with St. Pierre. But hey, despite the drama, St. Pierre's victory wasn't overturned. Lesson learned though. Vaseline on the body is a definite no-no in MMA. In wrestling, throwing opponents out of the cage is like a signature move, but MMA is a whole different ballgame. There's actually a rule against it, and someone did try to pull that stunt once. And you guessed it, that's exactly why there's a rule in place now. Tank Abbott's showdown with Cal Worsham at the Ultimate event in 1996 caused quite a stir, especially when Abbott literally dragged Worsham over the cage. It's one of those moments that might have slipped under the radar for some fans, but it definitely got people talking. In the opening round of UFC Ultimate 1996, Abbott and Worsham, both seasoned UFC fighters, went head-to-head in the no-holds-barred arena. But seriously, is it even legal to throw someone out of the octagon mid-fight? Well, it's not, but Abbott didn't know that. Abbott didn't waste a second, diving at Worsham and slamming him against the cage, nearly hoisting him up to the octagon's edge. For almost 30 years, fans have been left wondering if they were about to witness the first ever fighter being tossed out of the cage. Abbott isn't one to fuss over historical reinterpretations, but he's clear on one thing. He's not bothered by the misconception that he attempted to toss his opponent out of the cage, WWE style. According to Abbott, if he had wanted Worsham out, he would have made it happen, and there might have been more of the same to come. We were on the edge of witnessing a potential first, but Abbott was mere inches away from potentially changing the game in another significant way. With Worsham pinned against the cage and on his back, his corner was right there, just to the right of the action, risking getting caught in the crossfire. For those doubting Abbott's strategic prowess, it might come as a surprise that he actually thought through the decision in the heat of battle. While executing his plan and making a seasoned striker tap to strikes, Abbott consciously passed on the chance. Soon after, Big John McCarthy introduced a rule within the UFC to disqualify anyone attempting to throw their opponents over the side of the cage. Judges weren't always in the mix for UFC fights, at least not for long. It wasn't until after UFC 7, where Shamrock and Taktarov faced off, that judges were introduced into the equation. UFC 7 is infamous for its boring main event showdown featuring Ken Shamrock, the reigning superfight champion, squaring off against UFC 6 tournament victor Oleg Taktarov. Shamrock's legacy shone brightest during his time in the UFC and various other combat sports. As one of the inaugural inductees into the UFC Hall of Fame, he was hailed as a true icon and trailblazer of the sport. With over 15 main events and co-main events under his belt in the UFC and Pride FC, Shamrock also held numerous MMA pay-per-view records. Back in his early UFC days, he earned the title of the world's most dangerous man by ABC News, a nickname that stuck with him ever since. Alongside his mixed martial arts journey, Shamrock found considerable success in the world of professional wrestling, notably during his time with the WWF, now WWE. Within the Squared Circle, he clinched the Intercontinental Championship once, held the World Tag Team Championship once, and claimed victory as the 1998 King of the Ring. Shamrock also grappled in total non-stop action wrestling, where he became a one-time NWA World Heavyweight Champion, marking him as the inaugural world champion under the TNA banner. In 2020, he was honored with induction into the Impact Hall of Fame. On the flip side, Oleg Taktarov was all about Sambo and Judo, mixing it up in the Ultimate Fighting Championship and Pride Fighting Championships. He even snagged the UFC 6 tournament victory. Taktarov kicked off his martial arts journey at the young age of 12, diving into both Judo and Sambo. You'd think putting Shamrock and Taktarov together would lead to an epic showdown, but what looked promising on paper turned out to be a letdown in reality. The catch was that Shamrock and Taktarov were actually friends. Plus, Shamrock had plans for Taktarov to fight in the promotion he co-owned, Pankrasi, after their match. So Shamrock had every reason not to go all out against his buddy. It could affect his drawing power and his own ability to compete. The UFC really found itself in a pickle with this fight. Shamrock, the seasoned pro, didn't want to rough up his friend, while Taktarov couldn't wriggle free from Shamrock's ground and pound. The result? A whopping 33 minutes of yawn-inducing action in the Octagon. The crowd let their displeasure be known, with boos echoing throughout most of the match. You'd think UFC would have taken notes from the Shamrock-Gracie debacle at UFC 5, but nope, they missed the memo. And unfortunately, they didn't seem to learn from this mess either. Just ask anyone who has watched UFC 9 Super Fight. The 33-minute snorefest ended in a draw, meaning Shamrock held onto his belt. Thankfully, the rest of the UFC 7 card delivered some much-needed entertainment. This debacle did have a silver lining, though. It spurred the introduction of judges in MMA. This next fight didn't shake things up. Instead, it highlighted why groin shots aren't exactly a bright idea in MMA. Groin shots rank pretty high on the list of illegal strikes you'll witness inside the Octagon. If a fighter takes a hit and the referee catches it, they'll stop the action and the fighter gets up to 5 minutes to shake it off and get back in the game. If the fighter can't bounce back within that time frame, things can get serious. The fight might end in a disqualification loss for the striker, or it could be declared a no contest. But it wasn't always this clear-cut. The UFC learned the hard way in the Gary Goodridge versus Pedro Otavio bout at the International Vale Tudo Championships, won in 1997, which is a masterpiece in its own right. Why? Because it recaps a fight, without any rules to keep things civilized, turned into a showdown between man and, well, his crown jewels. Here's the tea. With the UFC on shaky ground in the States and every PPV attempt to compete tanking, there just wasn't an outlet for the flood of American MMA fighters. Between the OG UFC stars and the influx of top-notch American wrestlers diving into MMA, the talent pool was overflowing. With limited options stateside, American fighters sought opportunities elsewhere. Some headed to Japan, where head kicks on grounded opponents were fair game. Others ventured to Brazil, where rules were more of a suggestion than a requirement. On one side, Gary Big Daddy Goodridge, a UFC veteran with a reputation that preceded him despite his 5-5 record. This dude was no joke. He bulldozed his way to the finals with 2 lightning-fast wins earlier in the night, clocking in at just over a minute total, including a swift submission victory over fellow UFC vet Cal Worsham. Talk about a showdown. Goodridge's opponent, Pedro Otavio, was no pushover either, despite his quirky nickname. This tough Brazilian fighter boasts an impressive 11-2 record, but had faced a much tougher journey to the finals, already enduring a grueling 27 minutes of combat earlier that night before facing off against Goodridge. Now here's where things get crazy. At IVTC1, Goodridge found himself in a tight spot, under pressure and on his back. So what does he do? He gets creative and decides to make life uncomfortable for Otavio in a way that's, well, not exactly by the book. Goodridge sneaked his feet into Otavio's trunks and, without anyone seeing it, but later confirmed in interviews, proceeded to give Pedro's manhood an unwelcome squeeze with his toes. Yes, you heard that right. Gary Goodridge literally shoved his foot into his opponent's trunks and gave his family jewels a good squeeze. Otavio gets totally owned by the move eventually, and then Goodridge gets back on his feet all pumped, reaching into Pedro's shorts and tossing him around like he's a rag doll. Back in those days, it was fair game to go for the low blows in MMA. The referee was practically having a meltdown, trying not to intervene and stop this wild, crotch-crushing showdown. The crowd went wild, booing, whistling, and even tossing garbage, because no one could figure out the right way to react to watching a guy legally destroy another guy's manhood. But let's face it, using someone's privates as a punching bag isn't exactly the classiest way to win a fight. It was a moment like no other in MMA history. Seriously, never before or since has someone gone all in on attacking their opponent's most sensitive spot, though plenty have tried. But hey, that's when the UFC realized they needed a solid rule about hitting below the belt. Anywho, you've probably heard of weight cutting in MMA. With all those weight classes, it's pretty much a given. Oh, and some promotions like the UFC give fighters a tiny wiggle room, just in case there's no title on the line. But hey, those non-title weight limits are bold and proud. Unlike boxing, where you usually only see one weigh-in, MMA likes to keep things interesting with not one but 2 weigh-ins. First up, you've got the legit weigh-in, where fighters step on the scale to make sure they're not packing any extra pounds. Then comes the ceremonial weigh-in, where they pose for the cameras and do that dramatic face-off that gets everyone hyped. But here's the kicker. Weight cutting is a big headache in MMA, especially in the UFC. Even with rules in place to try and keep it in check, fighters still sometimes miss the mark and can sometimes collapse. In 2015, Yang Jianbing, a young flyweight fighter from China, was competing in one championship MMA when things took a devastating turn. He passed away at just 21 years old due to complications from a weight cut. Young's scheduled fight had to be cancelled because he was dealing with severe dehydration from trying to gain weight. He was rushed to a hospital in the Philippines for suspected heat stroke, but unfortunately, it was too late. His fight against Gaya Eustaquio was called off, and the MMA community mourned the loss of one of its own. Sadly, this is not the first time that the practice of cutting weight has taken a life. In 2013, MMA fighter Leandro Souza collapsed after weighing in for an event in Brazil and later died from complications. It was later determined that Souza took diuretics sometime before his death, most likely as an attempt to facilitate his cut. After Yang Jianbing's death, the MMA world really took a hard look at how they handle weight cutting. That's where rehydration clauses came into play. After fighters make weight, they get about a day to drink water like there's no tomorrow. But here's the catch. On fight day, doctors keep a close eye on them. If they're still looking parched, they won't be allowed to fight. It's all about making sure these guys step into the cage in the best possible shape, both physically and mentally. Safety first always. What do you think? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section, and before you leave, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Octagon Rivals so you don't miss the next ones.